Hello, everyone. This is Carol Dimitrov with OPA Community Outreach, and I'm extremely pleased today to welcome Theodore Naicker, and he is going to be talking about tropical and Vedic astrology toward a shared perspective. With so many professional astrologers attending and speaking at conferences in India of late, many astrologers are wanting to find out more about how the great two systems of astrology get along with one another. As both a practicing Western tropical astrologer and Vedic astrologer in one, it just makes sense to share with fellow astrologers just what all the fuss is about. In this talk, Theodore will take you through a short history of the two zodiacs, their development, their similarities, and their differences in application. At the end of the talk, you will have a very clear idea about what in each zodiacal system is showing you and how and why. But more importantly, you will have the critical key of proper context with which to discuss astrology with your Western and Vedic peers in an informed and amicable manner. So a little bit about Theodore. He was born in Durban, South Africa in 1987. He has a Bachelor's of Science degree in petroleum engineering and has worked in the oil and gas industry for several years. Theo was a professional practicing astrologer with an approach encompassing an ever-growing understanding and application of both Western tropical astrology and Vedic astrology. He obtained a diploma in medieval astrology from Robert Zoller in 2012 and completed a diploma in astrological studies with Rob Suskin in 2014. He has since furthered his knowledge through additional certification courses, personal research, and client work. He has given talks internationally, including the 2016 Breaking Down the Borders conference. He is currently studying Sanskrit etymology as part of ongoing intensive studies in Veganda Deutsch and creating lecture video series and articles on specialized topics in astrology. Theodore also presents regular podcasts with Holistic Partners, Ecstatic Existence in the United States, and Partners in the UK, along with occasional feature videos with Circle of Divine Astrology. His presentation is based upon a strong foundation in traditional astrology, combined with modern techniques, resulting in a pragmatic approach to astrology for the client. And you can find out more about Theodore's work at www.speakaastrology.com, which is his website, and also his email address is info@speakaastrology.com. And Theodore, it's all yours.
All right, thank you, Carol, and welcome everyone to the presentation. Thanks for being here. I appreciate your time. It's always good on a late Sunday. Well, for us over here down in South Africa, it's a late Sunday evening. I know for some of you it's Sunday morning, and that's the part of the exciting thing about having these webinars is that it has a sort of global outreach. So I'd also like to thank OPA for organizing these kind of initiatives. I think it's very helpful, and I'm very happy to present this topic in particular because it's something that I would really like to get out to as many people as possible in the shortest amount of time possible, because like I said in the introduction, as Carol mentioned, there's a lot of cross-exchange of information that is happening or beginning to happen now in the wider world of astrology, which I think mirrors or reflects the sort of cross-cultural exchange that perhaps was present in the ancient world between the East and the West from a traditional point of view. And I think I'm very enthusiastic about where astrology is going because of these kind of initiatives, together with some people in India as well as in the West, actually joining hands together to understand and maybe get astrology to a place where we are looking at both paradigms with the same eye and maybe some fresh vision as well. So the reason why this topic is so important, not just for the intellectually curious or the experientially experimentative people out there to know, well, what what do I look like in Vedic astrology, or Vedanga Jyotisha, as it is called, as the technical term for it. But also, I find that studying Vedic astrology in a traditional sense, I'm studying with one of five lineages in India that have been doing astrology since the Renaissance in the same family. So you getting a sort of uninterrupted transmission of knowledge and information over the centuries, which I find extremely valuable. And my traditional Western astrology practice, even from a modern astrology point of view, has improved by leaps and bounds, not because necessarily that Jyotish is any better, but because of having that sort of rooting and that sense of understanding and depth to it that I think Western astrology is beginning now to uncover and discover for itself, which is exciting in its own right. So it is toward a shared perspective. In other words, note this presentation is not called Jyotish versus Western astrology. It is Jyotish and Western astrology. And the idea here, I've got a depiction here of the yin and the yang, the masculine and the feminine archetypes as fish, also because I'm a Pisces sun. And so my view of things and the view of seeing and a vision is very dual in that sense. So for me, this is something that is, it keeps me in a humble space, but it also keeps me very much entertained and engaged. And I hope to transfer some of that to you through the presentation. Having said that, I've got some of the more boring stuff out in the front while our minds are still fresh and we are all still here with me. So do bear with me while I go through some of the technical aspects. So the overview for the presentation, I want to, this is probably like, I think the third or the fourth version of this presentation. I went through various options of how to present in terms of flow of the information, and I settled on this. So I first want to talk a little bit about consciousness, just a little bit, because I find that is the medium through which either form of astrology is being observed or sampled or digested or understood. And then I want to present some ideas about time and how that is handled in Vedic astrology, and then go into some of the space paradigms, which will, of course, then bring us to the zodiacs and sort of some of my thinkings about that. And then comparing and contrasting some of the techniques or ideas that are most commonly misunderstood by Western astrologers about Vedanga Jyotish. So this presentation obviously is not going to be also explaining to you the tradition of Western astrology, because most of us, I'm assuming, that are on this webinar are Western astrologers and are trained in the Western tradition. I just would like to enhance our understanding of some of these Eastern concepts and ideas. And you'd find a lot of people are actually aware of Vedic concepts, but not necessarily Vedic astrology. And Vedanga Jyotisha is not Jyotish as it's popularly learned or practiced through textbooks and things like that. Vedanga Jyotisha means that you're not just learning the astrology, you're learning the language, you're learning the rules that pertain to the mythologies and how those things are all interpreted to assist the understanding of astrology as practiced. So, and then I would really like to get to an example chart just to give you a sense of how it is working, how it looks like in practice, so that you understand when you're talking to someone, perhaps where they're coming from. Now, being in my position, almost every time I'm interacting with astrologers, they're either Vedic astrologers who think that Western astrology is irrelevant and wrong, and I'm also trying to convince them about the other side. And I'm also dealing with a lot of Western astrologers that perhaps not understanding Vedic astrology properly or fully. So I don't want to go into some of the comments that people make, but I would like to share with you some of the insights that I know from the tradition that I'm learning in. So, consciousness obviously is beyond space and time. Whether you're in a coma or whether you're dreaming, your body and awareness can move in an instant wherever you will it to be. And I think looking at theoretical physics where it is at the moment in terms of consciousness, the whole investigation into consciousness from a scientific point of view, I think sort of began with this Heisenberg uncertainty principle and the double slit experiment, showing that basically the observation of an experimental process is having an effect or seems to have an effect on the outcome and result. So then it becomes necessary to inquire into the nature of consciousness or the awareness that is the observer or the observing faculty of the person. Obviously, it's a little bit limited at the moment because I think the current definition scientifically about consciousness is merely just being awake. Which, as we know, people that do meditation or yoga for a long time understand that the waking consciousness is just as much as a dream sometimes as the dream consciousness. So it gets a bit complicated, but hey, we're getting there. We're making some initial steps forward to understanding ourselves and life beyond space-time connections. And that's why I think astrology comes in, because the more I look and work with those systems, that's what I find happening a lot. You know, Vedic astrology, we are kind of splitting space a lot. It's a spatial variant where we going, we're splitting signs into smaller signs and those into smaller portions and even smaller portions to get down to details in that way. Primarily, that's the basic idea behind it. And whereas the Western tradition is more, I think, on a time variant paradigm, where there are solar arcs, there are progressions, there are time equations. 1 day equals 1 year, 1 month after life, 1 month after life equals 1 day. There's all sorts of time equations that are being applied in Western astrology as the primary set of techniques. So that for me was very interesting to understand. Well, hey, it's the one consciousness of the person that is living life as a sequence of events or circumstances. And these are the two primary ways of us trying to tap into that person's consciousness, both as a sort of space variant, but also a time variant. And maybe, hopefully, that will become clear to you as we go forward. So the first thing I'd like to talk about is the time. And in this way, I would like us to understand the Vedic language, because I think Sanskrit is quite a, from a lingual point of view, quite an old language. And we have to understand that to understand Vedic astrology, because there's so much nuance in the language and even in how it is written that plays into how Vedic astrology is practiced. So I would just like to give you a taste of that. And then going from that into concepts about how time is being conceived in Vedic astrology, because obviously this is something that, astrology is not just a map in space, it's also a place in time. You're chosen to be born at a particular time. So there's a quality of time that is separate from the space. The spatial pattern that time corresponds to can tell you something. But there's also in Vedic astrology this idea that time itself has a quality that can be defined and quantified in several ways, even without looking at the chart. So I think that's unique to Vedic astrology, and I'd like to also share that with you so you get a sense of that as well. So just some little bit of history. So from a lingual point of view, from a language perspective, the dark blue on the map down there is basically the area I'm talking about here, or referring to when I'm talking about the Proto-Indo-Iranian language, which is based on a hypothetical subset of humanity. We don't actually know whether they actually were an actual group or not, but we are lumping them together for the sake of simplicity and for the sake of classification to be able to talk about it. So according to what people have written or stated, the date for this sort of grouping of people is about 3000 BC. And the Indo-Iranian language, attested to around 1400 BC, is a subset of that group. And there are basically two branches of this. There are three, but we'll just deal with these two for now. The Indo-Aryan subgroup, which is given the date 1400 BC. It's epigraphically present, which means it's been observed on like archaeological artifacts like pottery and things like that from around 3000 BC in a language called Prakrit. The Rig Veda forms the Sanskrit, the Vedic Sanskrit forms part of this Indo-Aryan set of languages, in which the Rig Veda, or the oldest text in the Vedic culture, upon which Vedic astrology is based, is coming from. So that's dated to be around from about 2500 BC. And then the other subset of this Indo-Aryan group, Indo-Iranian group, sorry, is the Iranian or Avestan ancient language of Persia. Old Avestan or Vestan, I'm not sure, but that's a bit earlier, so that's around 1000 BC. And there's evidence of that archaeologically from about 520 BC in the old Persian language. Now, it's interesting why I mentioned this, because this old Avestan language and Vedic Sanskrit share some words called loan words. So some of them here that I've given this Yasna in Avestan. I'm not Iranian or Persian, so please forgive my pronunciation of your language if you know it better. And Yajna, which is the Vedic Sanskrit, both having the same meaning, sacrifice, and Homa and Soma in Vedic Sanskrit, having similar roots, meaning sort of elixir or life-giving, rejuvenation-giving sort of liquid, fluid. So I just wanted to point that out, that is kind of the context geographically and the context in time, I suppose, that we're looking at when we're talking about, well, how far back could this go? There's a lot of debate around the exchange of cultural information and astrology between East and the West, obviously through the Middle East, with the conquest that came much later with Alexander and all that. So I don't want to go into those discussions about the origin story and who came first and who did it first, because quite frankly, our clients really don't care. And secondly, the first car was not the best car we ever made. So knowing who did it first doesn't mean anything to me as far as I'm concerned. It's how you use it. So I want to give you a taste of some of the Sanskrit language itself, because this is the basis of, and intellectually you may not understand this, or academically, but when you start to practice the astrology, it becomes very important, because the words and the jargon and the terminology you use, there's perhaps a reason for that, and analyzing those words through various coded mechanisms to unlock from the language to numbers has meaning in Sanskrit from a numerology perspective, a Vedic numerology perspective, which is also fascinating to watch. If you know anything about David Cochrane's or Russell's videos the last time about Fibonacci sequence and all that, it's very, very interesting, okay, to contemplate about. So I'm just going to say the verses here. Agnimile purohitam yajnasya devam ritvijam Hotarham ratnadatamam Agnif purve birishibhyo nutane ruta Sadhevam ehavakshati Agnimharayimashnavati Poshameva dive dive Yashasam viravattamam Agneyam yajyamadvaram vishvata pariburasi Sa iddeveshu gacchati Agnirhota kavikratuhu satyas chitrasravastamaha devo deve bhiragamat. These are the first 5 verses of the first book of Veda, which is called Rig Veda. It's the first set of verses. And you'll see this number 5 come up a lot in Vedic astrology. It's quite important. And actually, the normal translation of these verses goes something like, well, we praise Agni, the chief priest of the sacrifice, who's standing at the front of the door. Okay, the English translation doesn't really mean anything. Other than obviously what it means in English. But you can see here the esoteric understanding of this first verse has a big implication to how Jyotish is practiced from a numerology point of view, which you wouldn't ever know unless you were told this from a teacher in the tradition. So for example, this word Agni you see repeating 5 times. Agni is the word used for sacred fire that is connecting us to higher realms, the avenue of purification and transmission of energy from gross forms to subtler forms. That is what we're calling Agni in Sanskrit. And the first word here is Agni Mire. And you can see this vowel in Sanskrit called Le is, I don't know if you can see my pointer. Let's see if the pointer will work. This, you can see it looks like the mathematical symbol for infinity. All right, and this is in the ancient language of Sanskrit. So this Agni Mire, the vowel Le in Sanskrit has a connotation of infinity or ever unbound potential. So the first word of the Rig Veda saying this Agni, me, somewhere close to me in my vicinity or inside me, is also unbound at the same time. And that is the first invocation of the word. Now you'll find that it's then repeated 5-fold. And then each verse also has 5 words. Okay, so together we have the operation of the sacred fire 5-fold. And so that signifies that in the Vedic culture, we are conceiving of life operating through 5 elements. The normal 4 that we're used to in Western astrology, plus which I think also including the 5th element, which is space, because space is within which all the elements are operating. There is something like that in Western astrology called quintessence, I suppose, but it's not actually used in practice, whereas in Vedic astrology, the space element is used in practice quite a lot. So what is happening here is that the operation of the sacred fire is operating through each of the 5 elements and therefore creating in each step 5 things separately. And it is through the operation of fire that we're able to see and understand and be inspired to receive, download information and things like that. All right. In Vedic astrology, intuition is a fire principle, being able to see and understand. Whereas in Western astrology, I think it's largely based on the water element. Okay. So what is happening here is that in Sanskrit, actually, there are 25 consonants that are used. So here, each of these words in the first 5 verses of the Rig Veda are also telling us something about what each of those 25 consonants mean energetically in the language. Now, you will never get that if you're just reading the English translation or doing a word search for something. So when people say things like in the Rig Veda, there's no evidence of, nakshatras being used for this, it's like, okay, if you're reading the texts as they're translated, perhaps not. Okay, it's not an academic process. You have to sort of look into it much deeper. And there are universities in the world that are using Sanskrit for coding because it's the way it's being chanted as a binary sound is converted to binary 1010s. So it's very beautiful to see what those processes from binary represent. Some of the verses in Sanskrit correspond to things like the Vishnu Suktam, I think, corresponds to in binary code some of the solar flare cycles of the sun, which is interesting because Vishnu is the name used in the Veda for the sun of our solar system. Anyway, so just to give you a sense of the depth of the language, 3000 BC, 2000 BC, whatever people want to call it, it's very, very old. Okay. Let's move forward. So in Sanskrit, there are 25 consonants. In Sanskrit, there are 16 vowels. And in Sanskrit, there are 9 semi-vowels. And so therefore, the language itself is based upon what we would later call the Pythagorean theorem. And so there's a very deep mathematical structure to the language. And that really comes out when you're practicing astrology from a much deeper perspective, okay, instead of just following a textbook rule that says what the planets are doing, going much deeper into the sounds, how they're pronounced. Because in Sanskrit, the meaning of a word isn't just about what it is, it's about how it's pronounced. So the word Aja in Sanskrit, A-J-A, Aja, can mean a goat. It can mean Brahma as a creative god. It can also mean that which is not born. So the way you know which Aja we are talking about is on how it is pronounced. If it is pronounced as Ajaha, then we are talking about Brahma, the creator god. If we are saying Ajaha, then we are talking about a goat. So the language, the meaning of the language is also impacted by how the words are pronounced. So when you're doing chanting or mantras, if any of you do that in Sanskrit, it's very important to know how it should be chanted. Okay, so talking about the calendars, again, in the Indo-Iranian sort of subset or group, the Vedic Sanskrit calendar from ancient India consists of 12 synodic months of 360 days each year. The months are explicitly listed against the backdrop of the stars with respect to the full moon each month, because the stars are only visible at night. So it's natural to keep time using the moon at night. I haven't heard of anyone keeping time with the moon during the day. If you do, please let me know. These 12 months are actually split into 6 Vedic seasons, and in some cases there's evidence for it actually being originally 3 seasons, which is interesting because the Egyptian calendar, before it was Hellenized into 365 days, also used 3 seasons in their calendar in the, I think, the Old Kingdom period, before the New Kingdom turn happened. The alignment with the solar months of the lunar calendar were done every 5 years, with the inclusion of an additional month called an intercalary month. Each set of these 5 years was called a yuga. This is not the same as the yuga cycles that you may have heard of, which are much larger in extent. These are just groups of 5, sets of 5 years, and 12 of these yugas are called a Mahayuga. So the movement of the moon through the nakshatras marks the years and the months. In addition, the nakshatras, or the star constellations, are conceived of as giving strength to the 12 forms of the sun, or the 12 solar months. And you can look at these verses if you want to for a more in-depth understanding. I've given the references there as well. So the understanding here is that the moon is giving strength through the stars to 12 forms of the sun. So the sun is almost borrowing power in the solar month sort of way. So the Zoroastrian calendar, it gets a bit complicated because of Babylon and Hittite invasions and all those things, but this is kind of what I understand about it. It seems to have followed the Babylonian calendar, which was used in this Achaemenid Empire, which was the first Persian empire started by Cyrus the Great. This was also a calendar of 12 lunar months, but it was measured from each crescent moon. And as you may know, in the Islamic religion, it's important to have the sighting of the moon after new moon. Okay, so the crescent is a very important sort of form of the moon in that culture, and it goes back into, you can look at the Arabian cultures before Islam, and the moon god was called Sin, and it's a crescent moon god and things like that, who's the husband of a female deity that was a deity in ancient Egypt. So there's a lot of cross mixing of even religious archetypes in the Middle East that's happening around that time. But alignment of the lunar calendar with the solar calendar, solar months of the year, was done by royal decree, and I think it was about every 6 or 7 years. So quite different from the Vedic calendar. This was then replaced through conquest, where it became a 12-month calendar of 30 days, with 5 days added per year to account for the correction, or to align the lunar calendar and the solar calendar. This obviously is very much resonating with the Egyptian calendar at that time, all right? But this is contested by scholars. If you're reading papers from the 90s and early 2000s, and now people are re-looking at with fresh eyes some of the academic work that was done in the 70s and 80s. The Babylonian calendar around the same time adopted intercalary months based on the Metonic cycle. So at the same time, part of the confusion is that the Babylonian calendar also advanced around that time to coincide with the Metonic cycle, where they placed 7 of the intercalary months with every 19-year period. All right. All I want you to understand from this is that people have been thinking about time from a lunar point of view for a very long time, and from a solar or seasonal point of view, obviously for agricultural reasons, because understanding the seasons is important for survival from that point of view. But then why would they ever measure the sky with the moon if it was all about agriculture? Okay, so people obviously dedicate a lot of time to measuring time using the moon for some strange reason. You may also think about female cycles, but I don't think patriarchal societies cared much about that. But hey, that's my opinion. Okay, so coming to the Vedic calendar, a little bit more detail. So we've seen the importance of the lunar movement through the constellations or nakshatras in creating the Vedic calendar, as well as the importance of a 5-fold division as the concept of Vedic time. So 5 years forms a yuga, 12 of those forms a Mahayuga, which is 60 years each, okay, which coincides with the Saturn cycles and the Jupiter cycles, okay, so that's a clue to how they interpreted. So each of those years in those 60 years has a Saturn-Jupiter quality to it. And that's how it's interpreted in the astrology. So it's a different way of looking at time. In a similar way, time itself has been divided into 5 in Vedic astrology. Now, when I say Vedanga Jyotisha, there's a reference in the Yajur Veda. There are also some references in the Rig Veda, which I haven't put down here. Each of these 5-fold divisions is attributed to each of the 5 elements, beginning with nakshatra. So these are the 5 types of time that are looked at in Vedic astrology before looking at the chart. And they give you specific information about the quality of time, literally, okay? It's not telling us about time based upon the pattern in the sky, which is actually space. This is telling us about time based upon what's happening with time. So there's nakshatra, which is the lunar day, so around 27 days in a zodiacal month, not a synodic month, okay? That corresponds to the air element. And for that, we get an idea primarily about longevity, because the moon, going through the constellations in Vedic astrology, controls the life amount of life force, the life breath that is being given to you, the amount, the quantity, and the quality. All right. Vasara, or days of the week, we know there are 7 of them, beginning at sunrise each day. So how do you know Tuesday is a Tuesday? How do you know Monday is a Monday? When did that start? When did that count begin? Who started the count? You know, there must be a reference point as ground zero from which we've been counting the weekdays ever since. That's a very interesting study if anyone's interested in researching that, because it takes you down a lot of rabbit holes in human mind and thinking from a causal point of view. But anyway, we just believe that today is Sunday because the calendar told us. So we're going to go with that. But in Vedic astrology, that's actually been calculated in a lot of the astronomical texts, which is quite interesting, even if it may not be correct. It's interesting that people actually apply their minds to this question. So obviously, 7 days of the week correspond to 7 of the visible planets. And this is the nature of fire, because it is begun with the sun, with a fire event in the beginning of the day, sunrise, which is creating the day. This obviously has correspondence to tell us about your vitality and the vigor that you are living your life. And also sleep cycles and work cycles and digestive processes and things like that, which also require a kind of fire in the body. Then there's something called Tithi, which is lunar phase. And in Vedic astrology, we are using 30 lunar phases. 15 in the waning half of the moon, and 15 in the waxing half of the moon, repeated. This corresponds to the water element, as you would expect. The moon as a phasal planet has to do with water, but the moon as a transiting planet through the nakshatras has to do with life, breath, and longevity in this system of astrology. So we make that distinction here. This tithi tells us about the quality of your relationships. Sometimes even the timing of your relationships is controlled by this, and also shared material prosperity. So how are you exchanging intimately with the people that are in your space personally? Then there's Karuna, which is basically half a lunar phase. So if there are 30 lunar phases, now we have 60 Karuna. And this corresponds to the earth element, Prithvi, which is about immunity and which is about individual material prosperity. Okay. Then the last thing we look at as a quality of time is called yoga, and this is a summation of the lunar phases. And no, it is not the same as part of fortune, even though the part of fortune is present in Vedic astrology. It's not called parts though. But it's a summation of the lunar phase in some way, and there's 27 of them. And so obviously there's a correspondence there between yoga and nakshatra, 27 and 27. And this corresponds to the space element called Akasha. So you may have heard of the Akashic records. Well, these are the records in space. And this has to do with, obviously, our social relationships and also spirituality. So how are we connected to the world at large? How, so if I'm doing electional astrology, I obviously need to check Panchanga first, because that is controlling the nature of the time. So if I'm planning, let's say, a concert event, I need to make sure that the yoga time of that concert is excellent, because that will determine how everyone at that concert gets along together. All right. But if I'm electing a time for the launch of someone's individual business at a project meeting at work, well, then I want the Karana time to be very much aligned with their birth chart, wealth indicators. Because then when time is working on our side of space, then everything is actually elected properly. All right. This is something that is very different between the two systems, because there's nothing like it really in Western astrology from a time point of view. All right. Are there any questions so far?
I am not seeing, let me just see. No, I'm not seeing any questions at this point. If you have a question, you can type it into the chat box, and I'll be happy to make sure that Theodore gets your question. Thank you.
All right. So, so that's something that's very absorbing. I'm obviously not going to go into how these are used because I'm not teaching Vedic astrology, but just so you're aware that there's something else going on here. Time. I never thought time could be divided separately from space before, but this is what is happening in Vedic astrology. Okay. So now we can come to something that we're all familiar with, which is space and the zodiacs. Okay. So constellational and zodiacal frames of reference, that's what I think they are, frames of reference. So obviously, as a frame of reference, it's a perspective point, so you can choose. That's basically how I think about it at the moment. I might change my mind, tomorrow or after 10 years as I get more life experience, because I have still a long way to go. So the learning never stops, but that's kind of where I'm at the moment with it. So we've got 3 zodiacs, and I think they are like maps of light. So I think that looking at an astrology chart, you start to just think about everything in terms of light and not light. Okay, that's basically where I think everything's coming from. And so a lot of the traditional authors in both traditions of astrology will always exhort students of astrology to maintain a connection of the light within themselves. because light is where everything is starting from. Light is what we're investigating in its various phasal relationships between our planets, or not, if you're looking at outer planets and dwarf planets and or asteroids or whatever, or hypothetical points, cool, whatever you feel like doing. But essentially, without the sun, there's no astrology. You know, without light from the stars, there's no star science. Okay, and you could argue there's no time or conception of space. So basically, light is giving our consciousness something to work with. And the dual nature of light, obviously, is something that we are still looking into from a scientific point of view. But I think as we get more into consciousness inquiry, we're going to come up with something eventually. So first of all, you have the constellations and the constellational zodiac specifically. So the apparent path of the sun as the Earth revolves around the sun creates the ecliptic, obviously. And through that paradigm, we have the constellations, which we're calling the zodiac. Now, there are constellations that do not lie on the path of the sun, all right? But through the use of parans, which are basically quadrant relationships to the constellations, Dr. Bernadette Braid, he has done a lot of good work with that. And I always look at that even in horary charts. I find it very fascinating to see how the constellational paradigm is filtering into the chart through the angles of the chart. It's really interesting from a cross of matter archetype point of view connected to the heavens. So it relies on the cross of matter, the connection to the constellations, and that is irrespective of a light or dark paradigm. It just is. So the interpretation, actually, very funnily, is actually quite black and white. Okay, because it's quite far out and kind of involving all the constellations out there. Then we've got the sidereal zodiac, which is basically choosing a star out there, and from that star projecting equal 30-degree segments of signs. Okay. There are different reasons for selecting different stars. People think that stars have been selected because of precession. People think that stars are being selected because of some reasoning about the zodiac positions. But actually, that's not the case. You have to understand some Vedic mythologies to understand why some certain stars are being used to begin the kinds of sidereal zodiac that we are using in Vedic astrology. So generally, for human charts, we are advised to take the star Spica, which is in the middle, or the alpha star of the Virgo constellation, also from which my astrology business is named. And from there, and its opposite, calculate the zodiac signs. For things like health and illness, we are taking a star in the Gemini constellation. There's all these other kinds of things. So understand that there are various sidereal zodiacs that are being employed for different reasons. All right. There's also in Vedic astrology a zodiac that begins with Scorpio and goes in the reverse. There's also an 8-sign zodiac that is used for financial considerations. And there's also a separate zodiac that is used for longevity and a separate zodiac that is used for understanding warfare. So to give an idea, in some cases, the 8th house for Capricorn will be taken as Sagittarius. All right. So it can be quite different from what you think. So don't assume something when you're looking at a chart in a sidereal paradigm, especially if it is Vedic astrology. All right. So you can't really say, well, my sun goes into 8th house in sidereal Sagittarius. I'm not like that. Well, actually, the sun is in the 12th house for Libra. So it's very different from an interpretation point of view. And so that's why guidance or having a proper teacher is necessary, because these are the things that are not in the textbooks. Because Vedic astrology, my opinion about it, my feeling about it is because Vedic astrology has mutated and innovated so much since Vedic times with how the stars were looked at, and in a fairly unbroken tradition in the East, what the textbooks contain as far as Vedic astrology goes is probably about 40% of the knowledge, because the human mind over centuries has developed it further. All right. So Henry Ford's first blueprint for a car bears quite little resemblance really to how we build cars today. You understand? That's kind of the analogy I have about it. So looking for evidence in Vedic culture about how astrology is practiced today, yeah, you're not looking at really the same thing. And it doesn't mean it's bad, it's just different, all right? And the sidereal zodiac obviously has a starlight paradigm because we are now using the stars as a reference. So it is called sidereal for that purpose, okay? And the tropical zodiac, which we are all kind of familiar with from a Western astrology perspective, is that we are taking, and actually if you look at the astrology text in the tradition, sometimes they say things like, we're starting the zodiac from a solstice instead of an equinox. Okay, it's quite interesting to see that people were considering these things, but we eventually settled on the Vedic equinox, I suppose, because that was the most popular one, according to Ptolemy, and his book was widely distributed. So, you know, there's something to do there about marketing and publishing. But we are taking the spring equinox and using that as the beginning of tropical Aries as a sign, and also dividing space to 30-degree equal segments from there. This is obviously quite different to how the sidereal zodiac is created. Now, with the tropical zodiac, the signs of the zodiac are created by the sun, and therefore it has a sunlight focus from an origin point of view, from a creation myth point of view, for the signs. Whereas the sidereal zodiac is a starlight focus. The stars occur way out into space, way beyond our solar system, okay? So understanding your mind in space, where the sidereal signs are actually sitting, they are sitting in space light years away from us, okay? Whereas the signs in the tropical zodiac, which are created by the sun, is sitting and located within our solar system. And
Theodore,
primarily influenced by the sun. Yes?
Pardon me, we have about 15 minutes.
Left.
Yes.
Wow, okay.
We can go a little longer if you need to.
Okay, clearly overestimated the time. Let me skip to an example. Okay, let's go to some comparing things. Right, so some of the misconceptions here is that modality of the signs doesn't have to be linked to the seasons. In Vedic astrology, we do the modality of the signs based upon qualities of nature, which are existing beyond the stars, and out of which the stars are being created according to their conceptual theories. So these three qualities of nature are Rajas, Tamas, and Sattva. And Rajas corresponds to the movable signs, cardinal signs, okay? Tamas corresponds to the fixed signs, and Sattva corresponds to the dual signs. So basically, Rajas is about creation, creating, being quick. It corresponds to the planets Venus and Mercury. Venus controls the creation of animal life, and Mercury controls the creation of plant life. Tamas corresponds to transforming by inactivity. It's entropy, it's heavy, it's inertia, not being able to act when you should. It's controlled or mediated by the planets Mars and Saturn, and it corresponds to the fixed signs, which are of medium strength. And the Sattva principle, which is about sustaining, harmonizing, balancing, is knowing when to act and also when to stop at the same time. That is sustaining life and brings things into balance. That is corresponding to the sun, who is creating Sattva by balancing the Rajas modality, and the moon, who is maintaining balance and sattva by balancing the tamas quality. Jupiter is considered to be the balance itself in the system. All right, it is sattva. It is sustaining this mode and balance. So in Vedic astrology, balance and harmony is a Jupiter principle. It's not a Venusian principle. Okay, Venus and Mercury are quite unstable, and this is why clients come to us mostly because of the instability in their love life and also in their material well-being, which is a Mercury principle in this kind of astrology. Then we have the 5 elements that are being used in Vedic astrology, and they are controlled by these planets. So Jupiter controls the space element, Saturn controls the air element. The air element is destructive, it is unsettling, it is turbulent, it's disturbing the balance of the space in order for Agni and fire to emerge and have relevance and to be seen, which is controlled by Mars. Venus controls the water element, and Mercury controls the earth element. So these are quite different concepts. So Mercury controls the skin, Saturn controls the muscles in the body, because Vayu and air is about being able to survive harsh, turbulent conditions. So wrestling and things like that is a Saturn principle, not a Martian principle in Vedic astrology. These elements are controlled by stars in the sky. I've listed them here. Jyeshta is in Scorpio, it is Antares. Magha is Regulus. Shatabisha is a star, I think Sadal Melik or Sadal Sud. And in the Aquarius constellation, and Rohini is Aldebaran, which is the eye of the bull. So these stars are controlling the birth of these elements through the stars. The elements are created, and then the planets which are existing within the star boundary in the solar system are controlling how they are manifest on Earth. This is the idea behind it. Okay, so going through each of these, I've talked about the planets. The planets in Vedic astrology are called graha, which means they are eclipsing or seizing the starlight and thereby having an influence on us. Because the sidereal zodiac is light years out into space, the planets are not wandering on the zodiac. In the Western tropical system, the ecliptic and the zodiac are coincidental, they are the same thing, and the planets, or the projections of the planetary positions onto the zodiac are wandering along the zodiac. So the planets in Greek, the Greek word for them is wanderers, which is planets, okay? Whereas in Vedic astrology, the planets are called graha. They are blocking the starlight because the sidereal zodiac is so far out into space, they're not connected to the planets at all, at least directly, all right? The planets are taking rulership of the signs because they are seizing influence. They are not ruling the sign because they are maintaining it. Seasons are different. I want to go to a chart. Oh, sorry. Signs, how they created. So I'll take Aries as an example. These are the 27 nakshatras, the division of space and the constellations, and they're controlled by the moon, remember, because the moon helps us to observe the night sky. And if I take the division of 9, which is important for the moon from a numerology point of view, each nakshatra is like a home of the moon. And the moon, because of its tidal influence, the number 4 becomes important because tides operate as quadrants around the Earth, and that is controlled and created by the moon. So separating each nakshatra into 4 parts called padas is what is done for 4. And then if you count 9 after that, so if I count the first 9 steps or padas, right, you'll see that there's 1 extra fire element. There's 3 instead of 2. So that is why the first sign is fire in Vedic astrology. And similarly, in the next portion of 9, there's 1 extra earth element. Therefore, this sign is earth. So the elements of the signs are derived from the nakshatras in this way. I have to move on, so let me. Another thing that people question as well is the 27 or the 28 nakshatras. It's so confusing, it's not consistent. Well, actually, it's about sacred geometry. The circle of 27 lunar mansions is a 3/9 relationship, which is a feminine principle that is corresponding to 3 forms of life called Bhuva and Swaha. Then the fourfold form of nakshatras, 4 into 7 is giving 28. This is the synodic month. This is a square within a circle, is corresponding to seed as opposed to form, and it tells us more information on deeper levels of awareness. That's all I can say about it now. Okay, so they both are used actually, depending on what we're trying to investigate. The different chart styles that are used in Vedic astrology. This one is used primarily in the south of India. It starts with Aries always here and goes clockwise by whole signs. Why whole signs is used in this system most? Because remember, the sidereal zodiac happens light years out into space. So whole signs in this paradigm equals truth, equals source. Whereas whole signs in the tropical paradigm is conditioned by the houses. It's not really it's the substratum from a psychological solar point of view, but it can be modified because what we want as a sun principle has to be negotiated with all the other suns on this planet to manifest something. Okay, whereas the sidereal zodiac is fixed out there, well, relatively fixed out there in space. And so what happens in Vedic astrology is that we don't change the signs. The sign placements are staying the same: Aries, Taurus, Gemini, Cancer, Leo, etc., around clockwise in this way. And then the planets are putting the signs wherever they are. So the signs are changing, but the houses, the signs are not changing, the houses are changing. This is the chart that I prefer because you're starting with Aries here and you're going anti-clockwise: Taurus, Gemini, Cancer, Leo, Virgo, etc. This is the one that's used in North India. It has some Persian influence. It's a diamond shape. This is the sign, the signs are changing. This is Leo rising, you see here, as the first house, second house, third house, fourth house. That's Scorpio. So this version is not really Vedic or Indian because it's coming from the north of India where there are a lot of conquests and things like that. But these two are fairly standard as traditional in Vedic astrology. Okay, the sidereal zodiac is fixed, so signs need to be fixed. I'm going to skip that slide. And skip that slide, and skip that slide. Begin the recording. People can please read it and ask questions. I would like to go through an example, if I may. How much time do we have?
We can run a little over if you'd like, Theodore. That's fine. Okay. I would say maybe if you want to take another 15 minutes, and if people want to jump off, we understand. Okay. But you can go ahead, and then they can always see the end of the presentation on the recording.
Okay, great.
Okay, there you go.
I'm going to talk about the chart of Donald Trump, our friend. So I want to maybe share a perspective on it from the Jyotish, so you can understand how it's working in practice, because I think a lot of it otherwise is just something you've heard in your head intellectually. So I have to cut out some of the things. Okay, so the Panchanga is listed here. That's the first thing we will look at as a Vedic astrologer. So we say, okay, let's look at something. Okay, his Karana, we want to see his material prosperity individually. The Karana is ruled by the sun. All right, so we'd like, because it's the earth element correspondence of time, we would like the sun to be ideally in earth sign, all right, or water sign. Closer to the feminine principle we go, the more money you're going to get from the earth, because resources come from the earth, all right. And you see here, this is Aries, this is Taurus, this is Gemini. So he's got sun in Taurus, so there's a lot of wealth potential there. Fine. The sun is also with the north node, so chance of getting money globally, politically, across countries, across borders, foreign lands is there. That is the nature of the north node, to extend one's influence outside of the community into which you are born. All right. Then if we look at, I want to just touch on one aspect of this chart, which I don't think a lot of astrologers, even the Vedic astrologers, have been putting out there online, just so you get an idea. This sign here is Cancer. And in Vedic astrology, having Saturn in Cancer is one of the clear signs for attaining high, very high social status. Very high social status. Saturn in Cancer is a controlling archetype. Because it's the sign of the moon, and Saturn in Vedic astrology represents the working class people. Saturn represents the people that are furthest away from the sun and the moon, who are the king the leaders in society, and the moon represents the big shot businessmen in society in Vedic astrology, because it's receiving the light of the sun. The elite businessmen are close to leadership in society and government, fingers in the pie and all that. So the sun and moon as those archetypes. Saturn is the one that is opposite, the furthest away from them. Saturn represents the common people. Saturn being placed in the sign of the moon indicates someone who has the ability or the potential to control the masses by giving them what they want, okay? Especially the working class. The lower working class you go, the better it is for this person from a power point of view. The other thing we can say is that Saturn is actually with, so the thing about this is that the Saturn in Cancer provides power and the ability to control through domination tactics and all those things, groups of people, or to play sort of separatist games between my group versus your group sort of thing, divide and conquer. If it is in the 10th house or the 11th house, because these are the natural houses of Saturn, okay, a Capricorn and Aquarius. This is actually occurring in his 12th house because he's Leo rising, okay, it's in the 12th house. But according to some timing techniques, Cancer will become the 11th house or the 10th house. So if we are counting from Virgo, then this power combination is happening in the 11th house. So if I look down here, you can see that his Virgo period happened in the 1980s, and that is when he had started his first foray into all of these properties. So his own Manhattan property business, he was expanding. There was a lot of acquisitions happening from dying hotels and all of that, okay, and those hotel chains. But when Libra becomes activated down here, that Cancer is happening in the 10th house. So that will give him power and authority for sure, all right? And you can see that his Libra period began in 2010, and he's been in that for such a long time. And he announced his candidacy for presidency in the Libra Aquarius period. Now, Aquarius is a very important sign for him because the ruler of Aquarius is Saturn, who is actually giving the power, all right? And the other ruler of Aquarius in this kind of astrology is the North Node, which is sitting with the Sun, giving also power and authority in the 10th house in a political way. And both of them have a very strong connection in Vedic astrology called sign aspect, where the signs, independent of the planets, have a connection, all right? And the signs, by virtue of their interrelationships, are forcing connections between whatever is in them as signs, all right? And let's not also forget that Aquarius is 10 signs away from Taurus. So it's the 10th house from the Sun, which is furthering the extent and reach of power. I just wanted to give you a sample. Because Saturn is with Venus, this is triggered also every time he has a major relationship. I'll use this timing system to tell me about what he wants to do. I'll use this timing system to tell me about what he ends up doing about it, and I'll use this timing system to tell me what the word is giving him. These are three aspects of life that we always have to look at in prediction, all right? In Vedic astrology, they are separated quite clearly. So obviously what he's doing as marriage and things, I will see from this timing system here in the middle. So if you look at the first one that happened here in 1975 to 1978, this Venus period here, this little one here, that was the time of his first marriage. And also, coincidentally, in that time, he also opened his first business in Manhattan. The second time the Venus was activated was a Jupiter-Venus period in 1990 to 1992. That is when, while he was married, he was seeing somebody else, allegedly, okay, which is the Stormy Daniels character. No, not Stormy Daniels. He was seeing someone else that became his second wife eventually. And actually around that same time, he was having a lot of business losses, all right? So you see, whenever he's maintaining his marriage, because that Venus is sitting with that power-giving Saturn, as long as he's keeping his marriage partner happy and there, his finance and power is not going anywhere, all right? Then we come to the Saturn period. Obviously, this is when we expect this major power to be given to him. It also nicely coincides with this time period beginning in 2010, which when the world is saying right now, from 2010 to 2017, we are giving you the power. That's what the world is saying. It coincides with the Saturn period. Now, when he had a Saturn-Venus period in this period, 2005-2008, that is when he married Melania. That is also when he had this alleged affair with Stormy Daniels. That is also when his businesses started to pick up all of a sudden. Before that, he was having all these Trump University stories and failed businesses, ideas, and casinos. But once he married again, that power was reset and it stayed. Okay? So you may think, because the 12th house in Vedic astrology is not just about, it's also about charities. And I said Saturn is about big muscles, and Venus in Vedic astrology has to do about sportsmanship and athleticism, because you're playing as a team, you're traveling as a team, you're washing as a team, you're winning as a team. It's a Venus sort of archetype, sports, unless the individual sports like, shot put or something like that. So he's actually given a lot of charities too, like WWE, Wrestling Foundation, and sports charities. That's his 12th house. That's what he's giving charity to, all right? And the last thing I want to mention is that you're also seeing that or just to compare, now this is a temporary power that is being given to him because this Saturn in Cancer is not naturally occurring in the 10th or 11th house of his chart. Whereas in the case of Hitler, all right, he is Libra rising Vedic with the Saturn in Cancer in the 10th house. So when it becomes activated, it is definitely a global influence, for sure. And he did take power. The masses lifted him up in a certain way, and that is the nature of getting power through Saturn in Cancer from the rules of Vedic astrology. So I just wanted to share that, and coincidentally, when he went through his Libra period, as you can see here, in 1934, he was in his Virgo period, so the Saturn was in the 11th house from Virgo, and that is when he was made Chancellor of Germany. As soon as he went into his Libra period, which is actually activating this on a global level, because Saturn is in the 10th house and 10th house from Libra, that was when he got total power of Germany as Führer. And the rest is history. You can see the whole of World War I happened between 1939 and 1945, precisely in this power-giving period. Okay. So that's all I wanted to share. There was a lot more I wanted to share, but that's kind of all I wanted to say in terms of the astrology. And hopefully I've given you some idea about how it works also in practice. It was a bit of a whirlwind, but watch the video at like half the speed. You might make sense of it. Here are some references for some of the history and the ongoing academic research into the histories of the zodiacs. You can look at for yourself. And I do consultations, I do private or group tutoring in either form of astrology, I do rectification for yourself or your clients, and there's discounts there, and also I have retainers for clients who want to do that as well each month. I've had a financial astrology workshop this last weekend, yesterday. That's available for purchase, recordings. This is Western traditional astrology. And I'm having a 2-day workshop at the end of the month on predictive astrology in Western astrology, if anyone is interested. And other than that, thank you very much for listening, and thank you for your time, and thank you to Opa and Carol for organizing all of this.
Thank you so much, Theodore. This was just so rich with information, and I know that everyone will be thrilled to get the recording later to be able to review the information. And yes, we could use actually a whole day with you. There's just so much information. So again, we appreciate your time and your wonderful presentation. It was just very interesting. And do we have anyone that has maybe a last-minute question for Theodore? We're getting Carolyn wrote, fascinating, so worth reviewing time and time again. So thank you, Carolyn. We have a lot of nice comments here. Asu is writing, thank you. Susie, beautiful. So everyone has really enjoyed your presentation, and we really appreciate the time and effort you put into this.
Glad it's been understood. So if there are any questions, please feel free to email me if you'd like some follow-up or something as well. I can answer some questions as well that way, no problem.
Thank you. And Armin Diaz also wrote thank you, that it was very interesting. So again, if you have further questions for Theodore, you can go ahead and send him an email. Please be sure to visit his website and take a look at all of his offerings. He has a lot of wonderful things going on. And again, Theodore, thank you so much. And I look forward
My pleasure.
to sending out the presentation later on today. The latest you should get it is tomorrow afternoon. So again, thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you, Theodore. Have a wonderful day, everyone.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.